SharePoint Server 2010 includes several workflows you can begin using right away to manage your business processes. Just add them to a list or library, choose a few basic settings like the associated task lists, approvers, workflow message, and due date. Users can then start the workflow on their documents or list items. You can customize these same workflows in SharePoint Designer 2010. Just click Workflows in the navigation pane and you see them under Globally Reusable Workflows. You won't see all of the workflows in SharePoint Server, but you will see those built in the declarative workflow format, like the Approval, Collect Feedback, and Collect Signatures workflows. For these workflows, you can customize task behaviors, completion conditions, workflow forms, and more, all without writing a line of code. As a first step, I'll customize the Approval workflow, but when I click it, I get a message saying it's read-only. This is because I'm logged in as a site designer. Only site collection administrators can edit the workflow directly. But that's okay, because it's a good practice to work off a copy of the original rather than edit the original so we don't break anything on the site. So we give the workflow a name, and we go with all content types. This opens SharePoint Designer's full-screen workflow editor that you use to create and customize workflows. At first glance, this looks a little empty with just one line representing the workflow. But the Approval workflow action on this line represents a complete task process framework. The task process itself has events for when the process starts, when it's in progress, and when it ends. While it's in progress, there are individual events for each task: when the task starts, when it's in progress, and when it ends. These task events continue in this looping pattern until the completion conditions for the task process are met. At that point, the task process completes and the larger workflow can resume, which can then perform additional actions, start new workflows, and so on. When we click this action, we're taken to a new summary page that is specifically for task processes. On the page, you can change all of the objects related to the task process. Under Task Form fields, you can add new or existing fields. Under Task Outcomes, you can change the default approved or rejected buttons on the task completion form, or add more outcomes here. Under Settings, choose whether to allow users to reassign or change requests on the task form, and whether to restrict workflow tasks to just the recipients and owners of the task process. Under Task Information, you can change the name and owner of the task process. But most importantly, under Customization, you can directly customize the completion conditions, the behaviors of individual tasks, and the behaviors of the task process. Clicking these links takes you to the Task Process Editor, where you can add and change the behaviors at each event in the task process. So looking at the workflow we created, I'd like to use it to manage a white paper authoring process in my organization. To do this, I'll restrict the start options available to users, change the fields on the initiation form, change the behavior of a task, change the completion conditions for the task process, and add a new behavior to the end of the task process. As my first step, I'd like to restrict the start options of the workflow by disabling the automatic start when items are created or changed. This prevents these options from being selected when the workflow is set up, so that no workflows are mistakenly started. Next, I'll change the fields on the initiation and association forms. These are the forms used to set up and start the workflow. I want to hide the Approvers field when the workflow is started by white paper authors, but show it when the workflow is set up. To do so, I modify Approvers, and for When to Collect, I choose Association Form. I'll leave the other default options as they are. I also want to do this for the CC, or Carbon Copy field. I'll modify it, change it to Association Only, and then Finish. So we're locking things down a bit by preventing assigned task and task emails from going outside the group of approvers. Next, I want to add a new parameter called White Paper Title that authors will use when starting the workflow. I'll add a name, a description, and I want this parameter to be collected during initiation. I'll give it a default value for the white paper, and then Finish. Later in this video, we'll revisit this parameter as we use the data for different purposes. Next, I'll edit the contents of the workflow and then the task process in the workflow. The first thing I want to do here is change the behavior during one of the task events. So I click here to change the behavior of a single task. As I scroll down the page, I see each event for the task: when it's assigned, pending, expires, deleted, and completes. And during each event, the behaviors that happen, like sending task notifications, logging status, and setting variables. For my custom workflow, I want to edit the email that gets sent when the task is first assigned. So next to Email Task Notification, I click Current Task. In the Define Email Message dialog, I'll remove some of the text about problems accessing the task list and instead add a new step about who to contact if they have problems, specifically the person who set up the workflow in the first place. So I add a lookup here, choose Workflow Context as the data source, and for field, I choose Associator. For returning the field as, I want to insert the email address so they can click the link to contact the workflow associator, the person who set up the workflow. By changing the task notification mail like this, participants won't keep asking the person who started the workflow for help. Instead, they'll ask the person who set up the workflow. While customizing the behaviors for the task, I'd like to add logic that keeps the workflow running even when an approver is out of the office and not checking mail. To do this, I'll go to the Task Expires event, and after the task notification mail goes out, I'll add a new action. In the actions list, I'll scroll down till I see the task behavior actions, and from here I'll choose Escalate Task. This will escalate the task to the participant's manager using the User Profiles service in SharePoint 2010. The manager, as a result, can complete the task or delegate it to the next participant in the workflow in order to keep it running. Next, I want to go to the completion conditions for the workflow. So from the summary page, I go to the completion conditions for the task process. Currently, based on this condition, the task process is approved only when every participant approves it. For my workflow, I want to change the number of approved to a percentage of approvers. So for a field from source, I'll choose percentage of approved. Instead of equals, I'll specify it be greater than a specific value. In this case, 60. So if more than 60% of the workflow participants agree with the proposal, it will be turned into a white paper. This completes the behaviors I want to change in the task process itself. But what happens if the proposal is approved? For this, I go back to the summary page and to the behaviors of the overall task process. Here I see all of the events for the entire task process. When it starts, which in this case sets a number of parameters and variables in the workflow. An event for when it's running, which includes substeps for deleted and changed. When it's canceled, and when it completes. For my workflow, I want to create an item in a list if the workflow is approved. So I go to the Task Process Completes event, and where I see the workflow status set to approved, I'll add this behavior. On the Actions menu, I scroll down till I see List Actions, where I see everything I can do related to lists. Of these, I'll choose Create List Item. Now I see I need to specify the list, and if I want, an output variable. I'll choose List here, and in the Create List Item dialog, specify which list to use. I'm going to scroll down and select a list that already exists on this site, specifically a library used to store active white papers on the site. But in order to create new documents in the library, I need to specify a name and path to use for them, since this is required in the document library. So I'll modify this field. I'll leave the path and name field and do a lookup for the value. And here I'll choose Workflow Variables and Parameters, and specifically the workflow parameter we created earlier called White Paper Title. As you recall, we added this as a string to the initiation form for the workflow, and we can use it throughout the workflow. I close out of these dialogues and return to the new list item where I see our parameter added as the field value. To handle file conflicts, I'll go to the default setting, which appends a unique identifier to duplicate names. We can see now that if the workflow is approved, a new item, or in this case, document, will be created in my white paper's document library. Since the library has a white paper template attached, authors can quickly get started on their approved white paper. From here, I'll return to the workflow summary page, where I'll save the workflow. Then I'll publish the workflow, so it's available to others on the site. When I switch to SharePoint in the browser and go to the Add a Workflow page, I see my custom approval workflow at the top, where it's ready for users to set up and start using to propose white papers. Learn more about using and customizing workflows in SharePoint Help.